Okay, guys. So this week we're going to pick back up in this section on. Well, I think we still need to finish off uh, the section on general testing, and then we're going to move into the section on personal tribulation, which I mean it's sort of a subset of testing. But I think we had a couple points carrying over from last week. At the very end of last week, if you recall, we had been talking about sort of the punishment that David faced after his dual sin of adultery and murder with Bathsheba and having her husband killed, and how, in some senses, David, it's not that it was an exception, but, he was told it very explicitly by the prophet Nathan what was going to come of this. And so the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about the difference between testing, sort of suffering for blessing, or I mean, like sort of sharing in the sufferings of Christ, like refining our faith in the furnace of Christian testing and contrasting that with divine discipline. So that's where we were. And one of the points that we didn't get to last week, so this is sort of carrying over, we're still in this section here before, where am I? Before personal tribulation. So just a little bit more. So here's David. Here's what we were talking about. But one of the things that I suppose it doesn't come so hard once we get a bit of spiritual perspective when we grow up to maturity, but something that's hard, I think, especially for younger people who see everything in black and white, is sort of not understanding why things are the way they are, or we sort of want to understand why God is doing things how He is. Why is this happening? And I think part of becoming an adult, I mean, I'm just speaking in humans terms here, not just spiritual, is sort of learning to embrace the fact that sometimes we're just not going to know. We're not going to have it all figured out. And it's super important for us to understand that there's a distinction between what I just said, basically that we're not going to know. That doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. And people seem to conflate those two things a lot. And it's a big problem, right? Because it's not that there is no reason for this. Things don't happen arbitrarily, right? God's got a perfect plan. We have the divine decrees. Nothing happens that's not supposed to happen. But that doesn't mean that we're going to see it. That doesn't mean that we're going to get the picture, that we're going to understand why things are happening the way they're happening.
But what is the point of having faith anyway?
Well, right. I mean, if we saw everything as it truly is, well, where would the faith be required? And it's not a complete black box either. And so, I mean, we should push back some. There are people who I think make almost too big a deal out of the fact that, oh, humans are so frail and what do we understand about the universe? And, basically pretend like we can't know anything at all. And that's not proper either, right? God gave us the Bible for us to learn and understand it. And so it's not like we're dead in the water, but there is a certain humility that we have to adopt in that, well, we're not going to get the full picture ever, right? And specifically, in some circumstances, we just may not know. We may not ever know with certainty this side of heaven. And so, I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to accept, but learning to accept it is part of what growing into maturity means, because, I mean, it just requires trusting, right? This is the whole faith bit, right? We sort of have to trust.
And after all, growing to spiritual maturity is maturing in faith anyway, so it's all the same.
You sort of see how it works, but I mean, like, believing that God has a plan and that everything has meaning and that there is a purpose to it all, even if we don't see it. I mean, it's not easy stuff, particularly when, I mean, and why this is coming up in this section is because the times when it's hardest to trust God is when we're going through suffering, right? So when we're hurting and in pain, or bad things are happening to us or those we love, and all this, we have this tendency to I mean, sort of cry out and say, why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to us? And if we don't hold on to this perspective, sometimes it's sort of easy to fall into despair and feel like that no one cares, right? That, if God truly loved us, He wouldn't let this happen, or something like that, right? And that's when this principle needs to kick in, that just because we don't understand it perfectly doesn't mean that there isn't a plan in it all. So that's one point. A couple of the other things that I had pulled out, sort of more highlighted here. This is something that we understand intuitively. We've used time and again the idea of parents and children because that metaphor is one that comes up all throughout Scripture. But I think it's Luke chapter 12. Oops, that's Luke 12. I think verse 48, perhaps. I'm thinking of basically the servant who is, So these verses, Luke chapter 12, verses 47 and 48, talk about basically how, so these are punishments for servants, right? Basically, the person who has more knowledge is going to be held responsible on account of that knowledge. And we also have James chapter 3, verse 1 that talks about this is teachers. So basically, because we know that people, basically those who have the knowledge, people who know better, God's going to hold them to account for it. And here in Luke, it's the exact same concept. I mean, it's said very bluntly. There's no way to wiggle out of this. Basically, to whom much is given, much is expected, right? And this is true also in how God handles us. So in this section here, sometimes people, in asking this question, why, if we have something that we've done before, right? Something, like let's say we have these so-called youthful indiscretions, right? Like I have highlighted here, right? Sometimes people do things that are foolish when they're young. It's not because they don't know better, right? Positionally, we kind of all know better, but they haven't had that experience before. And so this is the first time that they're learning from the school of hard knocks. Well, we sort of expect people who are older, who already have gone through this, you kind of think they wouldn't make the same mistake again, right? But sometimes people expect the punishment or the consequences to be the same, right? But the thing is that they're not the same. So it's kind of confusing because our conception of self does not change. So when we're 15, we think that we are ourselves. And when we're 25, we think we are ourselves, but we're not. We're actually different people. We have changed in those 10 years. We're not the same person. Does it make sense for God to hold us to the same standard? It really doesn't. It wouldn't make sense in a court of law, would it? Right? But yet people sometimes think that way all the same. And so this is true not only of age, this is also true in terms of the perspective we have, right? So the past experiences we've had growing up or the things we've done in our lives, when we are being punished for something that we've done wrong, right? This is the divine discipline that we've talked about before. We shouldn't necessarily expect it to have the same consequences that it did in the past, right? Because we're not the same people that we were in the past. And more to the point, second thing sort of marked out here, if we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and God has already made it clear to us that it's wrong, if we're not taking the lesson, in other words, the consequences are going to escalate. It's sort of common sense, right? This is how parents deal with children. This is how the law deals with criminals, right? Repeated offenders get harsher sentencing, right? I mean, none of this is, we've brought this up time and again, right? The fact that none of this is terribly difficult to understand doesn't necessarily make it any easier to put into effect, right? So when we feel like hard things are coming upon us and we're frustrated, remembering that maybe things seem harsher now because we ought to know better, and well, the discipline's escalating because we've done this before and we're not taking the hint, these things can be propositionally true in our heads, but again, we've got to believe it to make it useful. I mean, that's the whole point of this, right? Sometimes we might be logical and cognizant enough to sort of think our way through this and say, oh, so that's why things are harder this time. But sometimes it might just, we might go sit there and pout in a corner and get angry at God for having bad things happen to us, right? And forget to take some of this into account. I mean, but we have to grasp it. It's sort of our duty to, properly appraise the situations as they come up before us. I mean, it's something that's super hard. And I think we talked about this already. Let me go look in the table of contents here. When we were talking in discernment, initially, we had this section on self-examination where we talked about the idea that a key part of it is being just honest with ourselves. So, some people have a tendency to be too hard on them. I mean, in fact, many people have a tendency to be harder on themselves than they are on others, right? But at the same time, sometimes people are unwilling to admit just how wrong they are, right? Human rationalization is a truly frightening thing. So both extremes are difficult to avoid, but we just need to be brutally honest about where we are and why things are happening.
Yeah.
Well, any thoughts or comments on this idea of not always knowing why, but and
Oh
God
yeah, that
with us
there
where
was that one.
yeah.
Yeah, there was that one thought I had at the beginning when you started talking about it. This sometimes it seems as if God actually has one whole book written in the Bible just to address a particular thing, and in this case, Job is the answer, because there we see, although we're not talking about discipline with respect to Job, what Job went through was asking for blessing. It was testing. That's what he went through. Although he stumbled, of course, but still. Um, he went through something he didn't understand. And when he did ask the Lord about it, and he asked for quite a while before the Lord gave an answer, the Lord's answer was not to explain why anything happened, but to tell him, you have no business questioning me about this. You don't even have the rudimentary wisdom that's necessary for you to be able to understand what you're asking for. He was basically asking the Lord to disclose his entire plan to him. But the Lord was saying, you can't even begin to understand existence itself. So what makes you think you'll understand why this is happening to you? You have to trust me about a lot of things. That's what Job was about from start to finish. A lot of, I mean, we know because we read Job, we know that his entire experience came out of a conversation that God had with Satan. Job didn't feature there at all. He wasn't part of that conversation. His opinion wasn't sought. Nobody asked him how he was going to feel about what was about to happen to him. This all happened without his input. And that's how it happens with us too. And we see that in the end, God still showed him mercy upon mercy. He lost 7 children, he got 7 children back. He lost his wealth, he was still given twice what he lost. The Lord was good to him. Even when he was going through all that pain. I mean, this is something that we might not have seen in that story if we read it, but anyone who has gone through this knows that the only way we can get through this sort of thing, and remember his wife actually told him, why don't you curse God and die, right? So she was no help to him. She wasn't particularly comforting him through that time. How did Job bear what he bore? Even though he stumbled, how did he bear it? How did he not apostatize? How did he not turn against the Lord through everything he went through? The only answer to that is that the Lord was his strength on the inside, even when he was feeling as bad as he was feeling. And I personally know this, and I think anyone who has been through anything knows it, that the Lord holds us up in the middle of terrible things that we experience. So what I would say essentially is that just as the book of Jonah is written to demonstrate that there is nobody in this world who has ever existed or is existing or will ever exist for whom salvation will not be provided, the gospel will not be provided if there is any desire at all to hear it. That book was written specifically to show just how much God loves the sinner, however far the sinner may be away from him, so that the gospel is so close to everyone, regardless what time of history they're living in or where on the face of the earth they're living. Likewise, Job was also written to demonstrate that everything that occurs in our lives even when we don't understand, and even when the Lord will not explain to us, is something that the Lord has in hand. He himself planned it and he himself is carrying it out. And we can be confident that he is doing it for our good and that we will benefit from it in the end if we stay true.
That's
what I would add to that.
Before, but you remember earlier when I asked the somewhat foolish question, perhaps, of, well, doesn't God want the good for all people? Doesn't he want the good for unbelievers? Do you remember when we had that conversation? And we were
say again?
Like, basically, I had asked the question, I don't remember exactly when this was, it was a while back, where we'd been sitting there and being like, yeah, well, sure, God wants the best for believers, but he wants the best for unbelievers too. I'm just sort of thinking about what However, when we were talking in terms of the discipline, right, God doesn't discipline them as sons, right? This is one of those hard lessons for a Christian to learn, right? That,
as a matter of fact, God doesn't discipline them at all. What he simply does is warn and punish them. Just those two things. So, yeah. So, for example, we have all these prophecies in Jeremiah and in Isaiah and in Ezekiel, where we see the Lord actually sending messages to Moab, to Edom, to Philistia, to Egypt, and to Assyria, and who knows, many nations like that. And all these nations are being given warnings from the Lord. That's what happens to them. But whenever they start to become a threat, especially a spiritual threat, an existential threat to the people of God, then what God does is react with a terminal punishment. He doesn't discipline them. The pain that everybody, even if you're an unbeliever, the pain that unbelievers go through, that believers also go through, is just the fact of the matter that we are living on a battlefield. There's a war, and we are part of that war, whether we like it or not. So sometimes we're going to get hit by the bullets that are flying. So unbelievers do suffer certain things in this life, which is the point of as surely as the sparks fly upward, man is born to trouble. So likewise, even the unbeliever experiences the troubles of this life, but that is not God's discipline. He's not God's child, so God does not take it upon himself to train them.
Where I was going with
have already rejected his authority.
Simply that our hope is in the Lord. And so even if it doesn't make sense, right? That's the whole point of what we're talking about right now. What we should take as comfort for this verse is that there's a purpose, right, to our lives, right? There's a reason why we're here. And we believe that God will reward those people who faithfully serve according to what he's told us, right? And we've talked, I don't remember exactly when, maybe it was a couple weeks back, about hell a good bit, right? Like why people go there, why they end up, the decisions that led them on that path, right? And the difference between our lives and their lives, as a consequence of our faith, is that we have eternity to look forward to with God, right? And it's not because we earned it, it's not because we deserve it, it's because we've simply accepted the sacrifice that God provided on our behalf. But that makes everything we do have a purpose, right? All of the suffering we do will not go unnoticed. And yet, for people who don't trust in God and who spit in his face and reject the sacrifice provided on their behalf, it's their ending state, right? This is why this verse is talking about believers, right? Not because God's sitting up there as a big bad meanie wanting to send people into hell, but simply because God gives people according to, that which they truly desire. And for people who are believers, right? You remember the verses that talk about how, you shouldn't fear people who can just kill the body, but you should fear him who can destroy the body and soul in hell, right? What those verses are getting at is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Basically, even if bad things happen to us, well, okay, so what, right? In like the eternal weight of things, God sees that. We will be recompensed for the suffering we experience if we just hold true to what he would have of us. And so, like, once we believe, and if we hold tight to our faith, really nothing truly bad can happen to us. I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to metabolize, right? Because, people who are tortured or undergo really traumatic experiences, they may say, well, this is bad, right? Well, but is it? like in eternal balance, right? As long as we keep the correct perspective, is it really bad? I mean, like, and so this is one of the challenge, and I think maybe we get to this down below somewhere. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit somewhere. Yeah, right here. Like, is one of the challenges as Christians is that we know that suffering is necessary to temper our faith, right? Now, I think there's a verse in James that talks about this, right? About, okay, I'm definitely not in the right section there. It's down some here. Yeah, James chapter 1, verses 2-4. So take pains to be joyful, right, in suffering, for you should keep in mind that this testing of your faith develops perseverance. So let your perseverance develop fully, that you may become fully mature and entitled to a full reward, having been found lacking in no respect. So there's a reason for suffering. And insofar as we understand that, then when we go through it, it's, we don't have to like it, but as long as we properly understand why it's there and what comes of it, it's not something for us to be afraid of or for us to view as an unmitigated bad thing either.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yep. And I mean, that is part of the answer to this question here of when things aren't transparent to us, faith is the answer, right? It's what we've been talking about. Trusting here, like Romans 8:28 says, that God's going to work everything out for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, that there's a plan in all of this, even if we don't see it. Trusting in that, trusting that there's a purpose to the suffering, that it's not just happening with no purpose. That is what should let us have this mindset of taking pains to be joyful, even amidst the trials. All right, well, somewhat not related. I was pulling out things. I think I mentioned how we do this before, right? Just pulling out things that are sort of jump out at me in the study, right? Just as talking points. So this next one was talking about, I mean, we've talked about confession already. I think that was several weeks back, but you remember how we went over momentum and this idea that, even if we fall, we got to keep the ball moving forward, right? We can't let ourselves sort of like get bogged down and spiral downwards in all of this, right? I think we've already talked about this before. I mean, I think he just hammers it home again towards the end of this section that when we do stumble and fall down, our duty as Christians, so it's not only acceptable for us to take hold of, the restoring fellowship, how 1 John 1:9 says that if we confess, he's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us of all unrighteousness, right? That it's not only acceptable for us to take hold of the forgiveness that God offers us, but it's actually our duty as Christians, because every second that we don't do that, we're compromising the progress we could be making. We're compromising what we could be doing for the church. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to say too much more on these sections here, right? We've already talked about the dangers of excessive guilt. The fact that taking hold of the payment for sins that Jesus has already done for us, right? That's something, it's not something we do, but
yeah. So we could or Abby, do you have something you want to add to any of that, or we just move on?
No, just keep going. I've been actually reviewing this on my own, so it's really, really familiar to me right now, just because I've been reading through these sections more on Dr. Luganbill's site lately. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, it's good. I mean, and it's one of those hallmarks of teaching, right? I mean, I've had conversations with the professor about this before. Like a big central part of teaching is repetition, right? And sometimes if you like come back and look at something and you read the same thing 6 times, it seems like, well, man, why are we saying this again? Well, the reason is because it's important and you're supposed to have it stick. I mean, and so if you got it the first time, that's great. But, we just need to be reminded of it.
Yeah. Right? It doesn't hurt to have it remind to have yourself reminded of it again and again.
I mean,
that's actually what Peter says himself. Yeah.
Well, you remember the verse in James too? I think maybe is it chapter 1 where we have this analogy of the mirror, right? Like people who forget
Yeah.
what they look like. I think it's James chapter 1.
Yeah, it's in James chapter 1.
Yeah. So do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. Right. And so the point is that some of what we need to do to keep all of this in our heads, right? It's not merely a knowledge thing, right? And that's James's point here in this section, is that if we just listen to all of this and we don't go put it into effect, well, we're going to forget it because we're not doing it, right? You know, you may have heard walk the walk, don't talk the talk, right? It's sort of a pithy way of expressing all this is that, yeah, so repetition in reading and rereading all of these points is good too. I mean, that's the point that we were just making here about how, well, boy, this ought to look familiar because we've already talked this to death a little bit, but we need to also put it into practice. You know, we need to actually be doing it. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many times we remind ourselves of it, it's not going to do any good, right?
That's exactly true. Although I've also learned from experience that, you know, the more I talk about something or discuss something or mull something, whether it's in my actually the way I mull things is by talking to myself about them. It's like thinking aloud, right? The more I do it, the more I internalize it, the more it becomes the way I think, which means that my actions actually become automatic. I actually act according to the way I've been thinking, So, which is another reason that this whole repetition thing can be, for me personally, one of the ways that the teachings on ichthys actually really stuck and have continued to, get harder and harder inside of me is that almost as soon as I started learning, I was also teaching these things to my family when they would listen, and then on Nairaland. In fact, that's one of the reasons I went back to Nairaland. I wanted to go back to a place where I could actually keep exercising myself in these things. The more I was stirring it up inside of me, the more I was, taking on the challenges, the arguments, the questions, the everything that was thrown at me, the better I got at using these things. The more they just stuck inside of me. They became the way I thought about things. And the more I do that, the more that goes on to be the case, And it's easier to act according to something that's the way you already think, rather than putting on yourself a sort of external rule which you're either breaking or you're scoring points by doing things this way, or you're losing points by doing things the other way. But if it is something that's welling up from the inside of you, you probably won't even notice that you're doing things that way, because it's just the way you think. It's just the way you think. And that's what I think the righteousness of Christ is about, because he does tell us that unless your righteousness is greater than that of the Pharisees and the scribes, then you won't see the kingdom of heaven. And we know that these were very meticulous people who tried to behave in a certain way. They had a very codified system of living, but the righteousness that the Lord wants is something that erupts out of the heart. Mm-hmm. Your heart is already right with the Lord, and therefore your actions just follow suit.
Well, it's this idea that what we say and what we do is naturally flowing out of that which is already in our hearts. So, it's the whole reason why everything has to be inside out, not outside in, right? It's the reason why following these codes of behavior will never actually succeed in producing anything positive, forward progress, because it's flipping the cart and the horse.
Yes, exactly.
So Psalm 1 comes to mind, right? This idea of meditating on the law day and night. Well, we don't do it just so that we can recite the law, right? Because memorizing words doesn't get us anywhere. The reason, the benefit for this meditation and for always thinking about these things is, well, if you're always thinking about it, what's your reflex going to be when a situation comes up, right?
Yeah.
What it reminds me of I don't know, you can pick a profession. Let's take emergency medical technicians, the EMT guys, the people that when like an emergency happens, they're the first on the scene. They train themselves very purposefully to have these reflexes that are correct, do CPR, or if such and such thing happens to the patient, then you do this, right? And they train themselves night and day to develop these things so that they happen almost unconsciously, right? We need to take that principle and then apply it to ourselves as Christians. I mean, it's not just EMT. I mean, pick your profession. Like I said, musicians do this, right? They train themselves all the time so that these things become unconscious. I mean, like I said, it happens across a whole bunch of like secular fields, like jobs that people study and train for, with the idea that you train yourself, you train your reflexes so that when anything happens, that's what you do. And
yes, you don't stop to think through what you have to do. It just comes naturally for you to do things this way. That's the whole point of the training.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and a point that is very frequently made on Ichthus, right? We have this idea of epignosis. So gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. Epignosis is knowledge intensified, right? We have to believe things. I mean, and I know we've talked about this before. And so I was just making the point of doing, right? That's the point that James makes here in chapter 1 with the whole mirror analogy, right? But so like there's knowing things. I mean, skip ahead chapter to James chapter 2, right? Even the demons believe, right? Even the demons believe and shudder, right? So it's not just knowing things, right? But we have to believe them too. And the thing is, and here's the whole point that of what James says, right? This is the whole meaning behind faith without works is dead, right? This is chapter 2, verse 17, is that if we actually believe things, then it's going to shape how we act, right?
Exactly.
And so this is why faith and repentance are two sides of the same coin, right? You cannot truly repent if you don't change your actions at all, right? I mean, and rather than this discouraging us, because sometimes we kind of do resolve in our hearts, okay, I messed up, I'm not going to do this again. And then there we are falling back down the stairs 2 days later, right? But that resolution of we have other passages. I don't know the verses off the top of my head, but basically I think maybe it's in one of John's letters, like one of the Johannine epistles, basically like whoever loves the Lord obeys his commands, right? That there's the sense that if we actually believe it, if we actually, more than just having the knowledge of what God wants us to do, if we resolve in our hearts to believe that this is what is true, this is what is good and right, and this is what God wants us to do, then we'll naturally live it out. And so we were just above talking about how all of this business with, sort of not always seeing God's plan, well, all that boils down to faith. Well, everything we're talking about here boils down to faith too, right? That, once we know these things, we have the knowledge in our head. If we put that into our hearts, then when these situations come up, we will act in accordance with what it is we've chosen to believe and to make our own. And that's why the analogy that the professor often uses is that of the lever, right? So like the fulcrum on which the Spirit operates is the truth in our hearts, which means the more truth we have, the more effective God can be in using us. Now that's true of our own ministries. It's also just true in how we act, period.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, I suppose we're somewhat off topic here, but
No. Okay.
All right. Well, that about does it for this section here in the testing. So, we've been in this one for several weeks now, talking about the difference between testing and divine discipline, and just testing generally. This next section here, this is the title, Personal Tribulation, right? I have the quotes pulled out here. So some of the point of this is basically just how in school, when we have maybe, say, several tests throughout the semester, and then we have the final examination, which is sort of a more difficult, it's a longer test, it has more difficult questions. It's sort of the culmination of, do we really know this material? Has our performance before just sort of been a fluke? But have we really made it our own? Do we really understand it? Well, we have those sort of final exams in our lives as well. And it's sort of, we've talked before about how, like, sometimes, making up words like theology speak can sometimes be misleading, but this isn't just an English thing. Skip ahead here a little bit. This word right here, the Greek word thlipsis, is the word used of the Great Tribulation. So if you stick a definite article in front of this, then you get like the tribulation, as in the 7-year period in Revelation during which the world undergoes, great tribulation, right? So this word is also used of the things that believers go to, and that's here what Dr. Luganville is calling personal tribulation, right? And personal tribulation is testing. It's not like it's some different thing, but the idea is more that, here, as in this paragraph, right, that these are the final exam sorts of tests, like the tests that Job found himself in, where when God is testing us as mature believers so that we can demonstrate, it's in Peter, right, where we have the verse about, is it even angels wish to look into these things? But the idea that we as humans have such a great cloud of witnesses. In fact, I think that's Hebrews chapter 12. Sorry, I'm being a little bit all over the place here. But I'm just thinking, we have other humans and we have angels watching us, right? That, where am I? When God sends us tests like this, part of it is so that we can demonstrate our faith to him. And if God only sent us the little tests, if he only sent us the equivalent of like the test throughout the semester and not the final exams, well, have we really shown that we believe these things? Have we really shown that we've understood everything that God's put before us? In the same way that, as much as college students complain about final exams, they're kind of necessary to show that they've mastered the material, not just in these small chunks, but in a way that everything is interrelated and that they've made it their own, right? So, the lines here are kind of blurry. Testing is personal tribulation and personal tribulation is testing. We've already talked about how the point of testing is refining our faith like gold and silver in the furnace, right? Well, personal tribulation is the same way. It's just a little bit more intense. I don't think we need to make too much out of it, like draw it into some special category more than just, as we're doing here, sort of just understanding that sometimes the testing that we experience is more severe and more intense, and that has a purpose, right? The two examples that Dr. Luganville brings up here is one of them is Abraham, right? Which was short term, right? It was pretty binary, black and white. Would he trust God enough to offer up his own son, or would he not? That was sort of a split second decision, right? And then, of course, there's Job's test, which went on for a great deal of time. But both of those are these immense tests of faith. So not just little things that require us to trust God, but like the seriously challenging stuff that comes up every once in a while in our lives, right? Sort of the if you've ever played a video game, these are like the final bosses, right? The guy you have to get through to get to the next level. That's really how we ought to think about these, because once we pass these tests, we sort of graduate to the next level of spiritual maturity, right?
Yeah.
Also, too, God knows how to design our testing throughout our lives to build us up. Like, I think something I kind of do a lot is I kind of like look at testing as like, oh, God's trying to trick me or fool me or catch me, but it's not. He tests us so we can grow. So it's not, he already knows if we're going to pass or fail. He does it for our benefit, not his benefit. Like, it's not like he has to test us to see, well, I got to find out. God has to find out if Abby Baker's going to pass her test, or, he already knows, but we still have to go through it because it actually does cause us to grow. Kind of like when you weightlift, when you break down your muscle and put your body under stress, your body adapts and it grows. and it gets stronger.
Well, we have this metaphor used in John chapter 15 of the vine, right? And this idea that the branches that are bearing fruit, God prunes that they may bear more fruit, right? This is the idea, like you said, of God building us up. Testing is not supposed to tear us down. It's supposed to refine our faith. That's why we also have the metaphor of the refiner's fire. And when we understand that, if we actually put it into practice in our lives, and this is why we have the point further on down below that we already jumped to a little bit, right? Is that we don't have to like testing, but we kind of need to respect it for what it is, right? That God's sending these things our way, and if we handle them properly, they're not for our harm; they're for our benefit. They're opportunities. It's funny. I had a professor in college who called our tests opportunities. So rather than call them tests, we had opportunity the first, opportunity the second, and then the final was the great opportunity. We all thought it was kind of lame, like, even if you don't call it a test, it's still a test, Mr. Professor. But the sentiment was along the lines of the tests were an opportunity for us to demonstrate our learning, right? And this was how he explained it to us that made it slightly less lame. That by taking these tests, we would have the opportunity to show him that we were following along, that we'd understood the things we'd been taught, and that, they were an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we'd been keeping up, right? That's what just personal tribulation is for us too. That's what all testing is for us, right? There are opportunities for us to demonstrate our faith to the Lord and on the angels and even other human people watching us, right? Do we really trust God or not? So yeah.
Yeah. Testing is hard. It's always hard when we go through it. Yeah. It's not possible to get anywhere in the faith, to get anywhere in anything at all without passing through some difficulty. It's just how creatures were made. Whether it's bodybuilding or training for a professional career, or it is, I don't know what anyone could mention where we would say that there is value that anyone wants to lay hold on or take advantage of, where there won't be some pain between where we are and where we want to be. There'll always be something. But the truth of it is, a good analogy would be this, something that I don't remember if I read it or heard it or something, but someone put it like this, that was it the price was the cost of a thing, but I don't remember how they put it, but to paraphrase it, it essentially said that what you give for something is the cost of that thing. But what the thing demands is the value of the thing. If you can put those two things together in your mind, there are two ways you can view a transaction that you carry out. On the one hand, it's taking something from you. On the other hand, you're gaining something. So which one is the more important way to see it? Is it that what you're getting is so worthy of having that whatever you're giving for it is worth it? So if you were to buy, say, a Rolls Royce, for example, here in Nigeria, that's a pretty big deal. If you were to buy a Rolls Royce, is it worth it that you spend so much money, Or are you just going to get hung up on the fact that your bank account or your purse is so much lighter? Because some people make the transaction and then they spend a lot of time griping over what they have just given away. They never actually enjoy what they got back in return for it. in our own case here in this world, which is one reason that this world is something we should take very, very seriously and handle it very carefully. Here in this world, we don't actually see what it is we're getting in return for the things we're giving away.
Mm-hmm.
So it is much, much easier for us to get hung up on what we are losing, what we appear to be losing, when we are seeking the things of the world to come.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I have a great deal more to add to that. I mean, it's
I'm coming. Yeah, sorry.
You know, our duty as Christians, so difficult, right? Is that if God were to show himself to all people, everyone would, you know, this will happen eventually. You know, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. But that's not out of free will. That's just what his majesty demands. But
yeah,
God has purposefully veiled himself from the world. And
yeah,
because it's not a free choice otherwise. You know, we have that ability to
yeah.
choose. I mean, and humans are terrible
Yeah.
at gratification. You know, if you've ever taken a psychology class, you know that this whole waiting for the good things to happen business with humans, it doesn't work super well. You know, you can train yourself
Yeah.
out of it a little bit, but our natural impulse in everything is, you know, you may have heard the expression, you know, a bird in the hand's worth more than two in the bush, right? We want things
Yeah.
now. We want the things that we see because we can sort of, you know, like get the tangible value out of them. Whereas this wispy, undefined, you know, either future things or things after death, right? Well, you can't measure that. You can't see it. I mean, but the whole, and I think we've touched on this before, right? The variable here that makes everything so much more intense is that, well, the things that we're getting in exchange are eternal, right? And you can't put eternity, you can't put infinity on a scale because it just, like, it's super imbalanced, right? So if we just but bear up for a short time, then the rewards we get in proportion are eternal. You know, like it's like, you know, it's like in the parable of the minas. I think it's in Luke that it shows up, right? Where he makes, you know, 10 more minas from his minas, then he gets 10 cities, right? You see that scale? That's what our eternal reward is like. It's completely over the top in what we're giving in proportion to what we give up. But we will never see it. We won't see it until it's already too late to change anything.
Yeah, and it bears repeating. It bears repeating that because of the nature of this thing that we are fighting for, we don't get to see what the full transaction is. It's easier to see what we are giving up in this world than what we will be getting in the world to come. But just like you've pointed out, Stephen, it's an imbalanced thing. What you're giving up in this world does not in any way measure up to what you're going to get back in the world to come. Not even, there is no comparison between the two. Still, one thing that makes it really hard to make this sort of trade is that we are surrounded by people who think it's a ridiculous trade, because just like us, they don't see what we are trading for. You know, someone who goes with you into, or even if they don't go with you, into a car shop, and you picked out a vehicle and you paid for it and you came out. They see what you bought. Whatever the mockery is, they see what you got. But in this case, you're riding on somebody's word that things will turn out in this way or that. It's just like so many of these scams that you get via email. Someone emails you and tells you that there is a gold mine somewhere and he's going to give so much to you if only you were willing to give such a little amount. That's the way it sounds to many of these people, including fellow believers. And I think this is exactly why lukewarm believers are the worst people to hang around. If you're around an unbeliever, you know flat out he has absolutely no interest in the Lord. But a fellow believer is someone who already seems to share this thing with you, and they think you are crazy. or making the trade you're making, which actually would naturally make you doubt your own sanity, because after all, they should be seeing it too.
Well, I mean, you know,
But they're not.
which seems more logical to most people? Am I the only crazy one, or is literally everyone else crazy? You know, it's the law of large numbers. Most people would tend to say, well, if I'm the only one thinking differently, then I must be wrong, right? And that's the dangerous thing in our world is, well, no, actually, you know, I mean, just think about how small a number of people are Christians to begin with. And like you were just getting at here, well, our perspective, if we're taking things very seriously, is going to be different than people who don't take things very seriously. And we're going to seem crazy to them. And they're going to seem crazy to us. But in the end of the day, it doesn't matter who, like, what number of people are on either side. What matters is what's actually true, right? So
Exactly.
even if you are the 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 that think something, and they all say you're wrong, well, if you are actually right, if you're believing the true thing, then it doesn't matter how many of them are on the other side of the scale. It doesn't change the fact of how reality actually is, right? And you know, it happens all the time and stuff, right? Just because a whole bunch of people believe something doesn't mean it's true. Mind you, just because only a few people believe something, it doesn't mean it's true either. You know, like there's plenty of wacky stuff where there's only a small number of people that believe it and they're still very wrong, right? But what matters in all this is the truth. I mean, and this is why we always come back harping on this, right? That really the only thing that actually ever matters is, well, what does the Bible say? What does the Word of God say? You know, what's God's view on this? And
exactly.
I mean,
because only God is the truth,
right? I mean, and to the point of what we're talking about, it tends to sometimes people say you're really arrogant if you think this, right? That you're really arrogant if you think that you're right and literally everyone else is wrong. But well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, like, sure, there are people who probably take things the wrong way and start lording it over other people and such, but like that's not the point. The point is, well, is it really true or not? Like, regardless, you know, I would much rather believe in the right thing and have people claim that I'm arrogant if I'm actually believing the right thing, right? Than be cowed into, you know, joining them in the lukewarm opinion and foregoing the truth just because it made us uncomfortable to stand out a little bit, right? It's ultimately much more important. And again, this is, you remember we brought up those verses about, you know, God's the one who can bring actual consequences down upon us, right? You know, like the one who can destroy both the body and the spirit in fire, right? Like that's God, not them. So his opinion is really the only one that, I mean, and it's not just these other people we're talking about, these nameless, faceless people. I mean, what's even harder is when it's people who we otherwise know and love and whose opinions we might actually even value, like our families, for example. Well, what happens when they tell us we're crazy? You know, what happens if it's almost everyone around you?
To be honest, when you mention family, I love mine. I love my family, and heaven knows I was blessed. I was blessed with a good family. If I'm not counting in some of my siblings, I was blessed with a good family. But right from childhood, it felt like I didn't even belong among them. For this specific reason, choosing that the Bible is the only thing that's true. Nothing added to it is acceptable. So let me to demonstrate just how difficult it is to be in that situation. I think I've already mentioned to you that I pretty much thought my mind broke over the years, and what that was about was simply because my dad had one way of looking at life. My older siblings had a certain way of looking at life. And I was seeing something else. Yet every morning growing up, we had prayer time. We had our morning prayer time. It was the first thing we did when we woke up. My dad would call us together. We would sing a hymn. we would sing songs of praise. Then we would read the Bible. Everyone got to read a verse of whatever it was we were reading. And then my dad would expound it, and we could ask questions or discuss it. And then we would pray and everybody would disperse. We did that every day until everybody grew up and went their separate ways. And in many of our homes, that this was also instituted. It became something each person was doing in their own home. So we were a Bible reading family. How was I the only one who saw things the way that I saw them? I thought I was going crazy. Okay, so here's the thing. Either be crazy or be arrogant. How could you be the only one who was right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe everybody else is crazy somehow. How could we be reading the same thing and getting completely different things out of it? Of course, I knew that I didn't fully understand the scriptures, but some things were very clearly stated. How could those things be clearly stated and then you would still say it doesn't mean what it says? What did it mean then? You know?
I mean, here's the point, right? You don't have to have all the answers to know that sometimes people are wrong, right? You have to be careful because, and this is part of our duty as teachers, is that we can't just tear down people that are wrong. We have to be, arguing positively for the truth, right? Because if you just spend your entire life arguing against things that are false, well, there's lots more of those than there are the one true thing, right? It's just that's how truth works, right? Only one thing is true, right? Everything else is false. And so when we're confronted by these situations where we have, it could be our family, it could be like we mentioned, it could be almost absolutely everyone. You feel like you're alone. And we have other verses in the Bible that tell us that we're not going through this alone, right? We have other people experiencing the same things that we are. But this idea of they all think we're crazy, and we're sort of like looking back and forth at the Bible and things we see in life, and we're like, unless I'm really missing something, that's not how this really works, right? And you just kind of have to be willing to say, you know what, like, I'm going to go, I don't care how many famous people or if the rest, like, basically, if population wise, maybe only 90% of the people disagree with me or whatever, that doesn't really matter. What really matters is, well, what does the Bible say? What's actually true? And I mean, it's scary to do that, because then you take the step out and you have no other, you don't have tradition, you don't have, like, other people to rely on. And it seems like it's this brave new world of you and
exactly
out the Bible. But
it's just you and God against the world, right?
But the thing is that that's really not how it is, right? And part of our experience is that, well, I used to feel a little bit more that way, but now, for example, we have this group, and there's quite a few people who, if I want to just talk to someone about, like, we have these serious conversations about things that are actually true, well, we can sort of now mutually, like, sit there and say, well, everyone thinks I'm crazy, but you don't think I'm crazy. How many people does it take before you sort of realize that, well, like, now there's 5 of us, now there's 10 of us, right? And we're all seeing things more or less the same way, right? So we're definitely not alone.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question you just asked. And the funny thing is, I actually just sent a passage to my Abby while we were talking. And in that passage, I think you recognize it. It's in Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 to 12. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. I used to wonder why the threefold part came into question until you just asked this question you asked, and that cast my mind right back to what the Lord Jesus said constitutes the church. He said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. So the minimum you need is actually one other person. And when you have that one other person, the Lord Jesus makes that threefold cord, because he shows up among you. So that's just what, and this is what saves our sanity, which is why the scriptures promise us that the Lord sets the solitary or the lonely in families. So we can be sure that when we start out on this adventure, so to speak, where we know it's just us and the Lord against the world. I mean, we may not even know that. We are actually doubting our sanity at that point, because nobody seems to see what we see when we read the Bible, and we're wondering if we're reading it upside down, or, I mean, I don't know. I was in this state for more than a decade. I mean, as long as my conscious life lasted, until I was 30, this was my reality. In order for me to have anything halfway normal, I had to adjust the way I thought. I had to adjust my perception of the scriptures. And every time I did it, it hurt. It hurt worse than feeling on the outside of everything and everyone. So it's you are here where you are reading the Bible and seeing things in it, and other people are reading it and seeing something completely different. And somehow you're wondering, are they seeing those things in the Bible, or did they bring a perception and want to impose it on the scriptures? And when you argue with them, you're argumentative. When you question them, you're questioning things. You're supposed to just accept things in humble faith. As in, what is it that it's crazy to be in that situation? You start to doubt your own sanity. You don't even know what common sense is anymore. I didn't know. I didn't trust any authority that came into my life anymore. And this went on until the Lord brought me to Professor Robert. And when he did, funny thing was, all I had was Professor Robert for 3 months. So I didn't have any other believer. But okay, I did have my fiance, but just like me, she didn't know anything about anything. She was a comfort to me. But when I learned the truth, that was when everything truly stabilized. And all it took was just one other believer. One who loved the truth and one who knew the truth. So we should understand that what we are going through in this life is, it's nothing meager, it's nothing small, it's true. But what we're passing through is really worth what we're looking forward to. And we're not doing it alone. It's not like the Lord doesn't care. It's not like he doesn't provide support and comfort through it. He does. He does. And even if we find that we are alienated from the whole world, which is part of the tribulation we're talking about. The tribulation is not just that people are hunting you to kill you or to throw you in jail or to deprive you of this or that or to take things away from you. It's also the fact that you experience an emotional isolation from the world around you. That other people simply don't see what you see. And then you start to think maybe you're the crazy one, because how is one person sane and everybody else is insane? But then it turns out it's actually kind of the truth that the only person who's sane is the one who's looking at the scriptures and trusting that the scriptures are saying what they are saying, not what we want them to be saying.
I mean, I think something that's helped me a little bit in this, because I've gotten the arrogant accusation a fair bit in my personal life, is just understanding that, well, really, it has very little to do with us, right? Like, it's not like I discovered this or whatever, like that I came up with the truth. Really, what it is more is that we stumble upon it, right? We come into it. If we desire it, God will provide it for us, but it's not like we came up with it or whatever. And anyone else, literally any other human being, doesn't matter if there's intellectually qualified as us, more or less so, doesn't matter their past or their background. If they want the truth too, God will bring it to them. So truly, it's not like of our own merit we come upon all this, but we do have to hold on to it and believe it, right? I mean, and like you said, this is all part of the test, right? And we have to believe that it's worth it. It's worth our time. It's worth the fingers pointed at us and the isolation and the alienation and everyone else thinking we're crazy. Why? Because we know that it's definitely worth it, right? That in the end, when all things are laid bare, we'll be vindicated and we'll see that, yea, verily, the things that we stuck out for, the things that God told us were true in his word, were worth standing up for.
Another problem too, like our culture is really like there's so much just like it's moral relativism where everyone's just like everybody has their own truth, and whatever works for another person, it doesn't necessarily work for me, but you have your way of life, I have my way of life. So people are at this point where like, I don't know if you guys have heard on the news people talking about we're in like a post-truth world where there's a certain attitude with a lot of people in our culture. I don't know if this is just in the United States or if this is a worldwide thing, where truth doesn't even matter so much anymore to people. It's just whatever's working for me, whatever brings me comfort, whatever makes me happy. And if you're happy and comfortable too, that's fine. So when you have someone that shows up and says, this is what I believe and this is truth, when you have no matter if it's a Christian or even if it's not a Christian, if it's a political belief, people get all freaked out. They freak out because it's like, oh, you can't state for sure that you know anything anymore. So that's a big thing that's happening too.
White. People don't like black and white.
No, they don't.
Thing that's always been fundamentally incomprehensible to me is that's just how truth works. It's binary, right?
Right.
Like I said, you can't have two things that are mutually exclusive because they can't both be true, right? So, I mean, it's sort of, and I think we've talked about this before. People really do get wigged out by this when you first stumble on sites that take a really strong stance on stuff. Then suddenly you're confronted with the fact that for everything that you've ever believed, either it's true or it's not. And, once you bump up against the realization that a lot of people aren't believing things because they've sat there and thought it through a lot, whether it's momentum or tradition or because it's what their parents taught them, right? You sort of have this tendency to almost overcorrect and question absolutely everything. And, the right place to get, and I mean, the path by which we get here kind of varies from person to person, but the right path is eventually saying, you know what, we're not going to just believe anyone arbitrarily. We're going to believe what the word of God says. And then it's simply a matter of figuring out what the Bible says and means. That's it. That's all there is to it. The long and short of it. I mean, you say that, I mean, we can sort of say that offhandedly here. Well, okay, great. But, the Bible is, depending on how you print it, 1,500 pages long, maybe, and 66 books, lots of different content, lots of different literary styles, things that are hard to understand. The chronology is complicated. What's God's plan in the world? It's not particularly straightforward. But once you accept the principle that God's given us everything we need to understand it, if we just have faith, he'll provide the rest, right? Like that's the answer here. And so, this idea of, well, people don't want to say that anything's true or not true, right? It's not like we get to sit there and play umpire of what truth is, as if we could just decide on it and vote on it, right? Truth is out there. It's sort of floating around, if you will. And it's for us to identify it, not for us to make it. I mean, it sort of seems obvious, right? Like that we can't sit around and vote things to be so, but that's kind of how a lot of people tend to approach it, right? Like if we just get enough people convinced that this is the way things are, then that's how they'll actually be. See, unfortunately, that's not how the world works.
I should say, fortunately, it isn't how it works because people are. Because when you consider the hearts of human beings, you don't want them to be able to vote on the truth. You just don't want that to be possible. I mean, but you're right.
Something that I'm kind of interested in doing too is like, because I'm reading right now the 3 Satanic Lies. I'm going over that section in Dr. Luganville's study on the Satanic Rebellion and the Satanic World System, and I'm thinking, Satan, he tempted Eve. It was a 1-to-1 relationship with him and Eve. And then if you, I don't know, I'm getting into kind of looking up some like psychology books on people who are manipulative, the types of lying and things they do to manipulate other people, like cult leaders and people like that, like gaslighting and things like that. And I'm just kind of looking at maybe like the micro versus the macro, like, evil people, when they're manipulating and trying to hurt other people, whether consciously or subconsciously, they're going to have the same patterns as probably the devil because it's all sin. So I don't know, I'm kind of like looking at that, like there's, I don't know, like how does it, the devil's trying to control the world through all this disinformation and propaganda and all these other mechanisms. And sometimes like when you read about that, it's kind of like, it seems really, impersonal when you read about it. But then if you've ever had any kind of experience with someone who's manipulated you or abused you, not maybe necessarily physically, but like emotionally, or, like a bad relationship, I don't know. I'm just kind of looking at those things too, because it's interesting. It might be a good way to, explain things to people.
There's
Make it more personal to them.
There's systems, and you can sort of clinically examine, oh, this is how cult leaders manipulate people.
Yeah.
And then you say, oh, well, good thing I've never been taken in by a cult, until someone has been, or until you don't realize that you have been, and then it suddenly sneaks up on you, right? I mean, and here's where we get, so we've kind of gone on a tangent here. We have been talking about, black and white ideas of truth, and am I the only crazy one, or is literally everyone else around me crazy, right? These sorts of ideas. Is that once we understand that it's not because we're special, it can happen to anyone, right? If you take the human arrogance out of it and just understand that the only thing that separates us from them is God's grace, essentially, right? Not that we didn't choose it, because we did. We choose to believe, and then God provides the rest. But we aren't where we are on account of us being brilliant or having figured out the truth, right? That's why I sort of used the idea of it floating around out there, right? We didn't create it. It's not something that comes about as a result of our own effort. And, I mean, we've talked before about the idea of the blessings that come from the hand of God. All we have to do is not say no, right? And even that is too big a step for a lot of people. But we don't get where we are because of the things we've done. We don't come upon the truth because we're so brilliant, right? We come upon it because we trust God, and God leads us there. Well, I want to pull us back into a little bit more of what we've been talking about. Abby's point just here made me think a little bit. We mentioned Satan's MO, right? Satan's world system. That's part 4 on Ichthys here. Let's see if I pull this up. Well, yeah, so part 4, I mean, this is I think we've mentioned this before. This is actually a pretty good place to start, I think, on Ichthys, because you get a good bit of seeing how the world functions and, like the systematic study of it. But more to our study, right? So we've been talking about the personal tribulation stuff. That's how we got onto all of this today, right? The point that Abby just made about how all false teaching tends to follow the same sort of patterns, the same sort of deceptions as Eve. For example, not really telling blatant lies, but just basically twisting the truth, misrepresenting the truth, right? That origin of these things, like essentially the origin of the lies, the propagandistic system that SR4 talks about, right? Satan controlling, nations, media, culture, even, this whole relativistic truth thing that we just brought up, that didn't come about simply on, human motives, right? It's being controlled and used by Satan to mislead people, right? And it's not only the ignorance that Satan has a hand in, he also has a hand in, as very explicitly shown in the book of Job, he also has a hand in the persecution that we go through, right? God gives him reign to cause the hard things that we go through, right? Of course, limits are bound or put on him such that he's bound by what God allows him to do. But, we talked about this already. This is part of the section we're in here on spiritual warfare. The first couple of weeks we got onto it, we were sort of saying, hey, like, don't get the wrong idea. We don't get to bind demons and stuff. But, the spiritual warfare that we undergo, there is this battle raging around us between, God and then Satan's plan. Satan is trying to get in the way, but he can't do anything that God doesn't let him do. I mean, I was just bouncing off of sort of this idea that a lot of the problems and struggles and false positions that we see in the world do come from Satan, but he's also the one trying to get us to trip up and stumble by putting these barriers in our path, right? And in fact, and this is sort of the whole point, God lets him do it because we are making progress, right? So I wanted to pull us back to this idea that, God disciplines, his children as sons, right? This idea that unbelievers don't face the same discipline we do as children because they're not children of God, right?
Yeah.
Gosh, is this a hard thing? I mean, we don't have a whole lot of time to really metabolize this today. You know, we've maybe got 5 or 10 more minutes, but this idea, you know, if you're making a PR sales and marketing pitch for Christianity, you would think this isn't the best way to go about advertising it, right? Like, hey, do you want to be a Christian? Well, guess what? Your life's going to be harder in this world, right? Guaranteed. So if you don't believe, not as many hard things are going to come your way, right? But do you remember when we were just looking at Romans 8:28 here, and we were talking about how the thing that makes it all worth it for us is that there's something wider going on behind the scenes, right? This delayed gratification bit. There's a point to it all.
Mm-hmm.
That is why God let Satan put stuff in our path, right? Because if he didn't, if we are just floating along carefree in our lives, it probably means that we're not making a lot of progress, right? I mean, we need to sort of think about blessings when we get them, right? But if you look at the believers in the Bible, sure, there's times of peace a little bit, but most of the time it was like all hard things all the time, right? And
yeah.
So I've heard.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Go on.
Sorry. Oh, this won't take too long. So I've come across the Titanic analogy when you're trying to guide people to salvation. So like we're all on the Titanic. The Titanic is sinking. Do you want to be the happiest person on the Titanic, or do you want to get in the cold lifeboat and, you know, get in the frigid water, you know, and be uncomfortable in the lifeboat and have your life saved? That's kind of like what it comes down to. Like, yeah, it's going to be worse in our life, you know, for being a Christian, but we're going to be saved out of it, and we're going to get to the shore, and we're going to have eternity to live. And so like when, you know, you guys probably saw the movie The Titanic, you know, by James Cameron, there were people like getting drunk on the deck and still partying and like listening to music, and up until, you know, they started to realize that the ship really was sinking. So like that's kind of, I don't know, like when I talk to unbelievers, I want to use that on an unbeliever soon, because it's just such a great analogy.
I'm sure you should try it. I think that the scriptures were written the way they were written, as a sort of weird push-pull thing. It pushes some people away, pulls some people in, you know. Lord Jesus himself said, this is very, very interesting to note. He said in one context that if you want to come after me, you have to take up your cross, deny yourself, take up your cross daily, deny yourself, and follow me. If anyone wants to save his life in this world, he will lose it. If anyone loses his life for my sake in this world, he will find it. That's what he said in one context. In another context, someone said, Lord, I will follow you. And he said, the birds of the air have their own nests, and even foxes have holes. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So basically, it was almost like he was telling him, you better not unless you actually know you want to deal with what comes with following me. So he did say in another place, my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Well, how about
I see that is the
talking about metaphor or parables here? How about count the cost, right?
Exactly. You know,
we have this spoken by the Lord himself about, hey, you know what? Like, we sort of have all these difficulties that come up. Are you really willing to commit? Are you really willing to do it? Right?
Yeah, because it's going to be hard. And this bit is what troubles me, because it is what Christians today reject right out of hand. How could it be hard? We are following God. God is not supposed to make things hard.
Yeah, he's omnipotent.
And yet, And you know, the funny thing is, there's something Professor Robert says. I don't think I can remember it well enough now, but it always nowadays it calls back to mind what John said, that he has his winnowing fan in his hand, and he will winnow out his threshing floor. He will gather the grain into his barn and burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. Funny thing is, even though this is just an analogy, it is a perfect way to understand creation. The same way that we view grain is the way that the Lord views both the angels and human beings. We have to remember that he exists on a much higher reality than we do. I mean, consider, for example, that we ride horses typically, or if a majestic king of the past were to go outside, it's true that sometimes men will carry them on their shoulders, but sometimes too they would be drawn in chariots by horses. That could happen. But the Lord rides on the cherubim, and they're higher life form, if we're looking for higher life forms, than human beings. That's to tell you that in his eyes, even though he values us so much, there is such a great distance. He values us and he loves us, but you see, the distance in reality between me and my neighbor's cat is smaller than the distance between the Lord and us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we understand that, we will understand that he built this world specifically to get grain. And therefore, he looks at some of us exactly as we look at chaff. So getting this idea into our heads that things ought not to be so, as if the Lord exists for our benefit, is a crazy, crazy thought.
Well,
the Lord made us for himself, for his own pleasure.
So
and therefore, if we are failing to bring him pleasure, go on.
I was going to say, just how about considering this idea, the thing that we're sort of talking about, what people have issues with, this whole, well, if I become a Christian, why should my life get harder sort of thing? See, it gets on the idea that people have that this life's supposed to make us happy, right? That the purpose in life is like happiness and fulfillment and contentment. And when you think about that, that's such a human-centric perspective, just from where we're going with this, is that that's not why we exist. That's not why the universe exists. God didn't create us so that we could have a peaceful, boring, content life here on Earth. That's not the point at all. I mean, it's one of the things. You know how Professor Robert always sort of weighs in against how there's nothing wrong with marriage. Marriage is a blessing that God's given us and all that great stuff. But that the fact that Laodicean churches are so obsessed with this idea of relationships that they spend 80% of their sermons talking about like marital happiness and success and things like this, that it's like, there's nothing wrong with it, but like also that's not the point of life, right? Like there's a lot more.
It's not the point. It's not the point. As in, literally, there is nothing that's happening around us that is the point. The point is the Lord. It's as if human beings wish to dictate to the Lord why he had to make us. As in, he created us for our benefit. He created us for, as if we told him, at this point, you're going to create human beings, and this is exactly how their lives ought to be, which is madness.
Well, I mean,
we exist because it pleases him for us to exist. And therefore, our existence has to, especially because he gave us the ability to make a choice about pleasing him, our existence is only meaningful insofar as we are pleasing him. If we are not pleasing him, we're exactly like chaff. We're meaningless, we're useless. This world is the threshing floor. Carry on.
A whole step forward. You remember how we started today with the question of why? Why are these things happening? Right?
Yeah.
This is the false path you go down if you don't accept the answer, well, God's got it all in hand. You sort of stop saying, well, hold up. Now we're not just going to question God. We're going to tell him what he needs to do, right? I mean, let's go back to Satan's world system where we were, right? Abby said she was looking at this earlier, the satanic lies. Well, part one is rejecting the truth, right? So I don't need God, right? And then number two is I'm like God. And then number three is God needs me, right? See, this is where a lot of people are, right? this idea that oh, you know, for example, God needs us to go do evangelism or do good things in the world. Like basically the world's a bad place and we as Christians need to sit around and fix it, right?
Yeah.
All of this
Yeah, carry on.
Fundamentally appropriating the things that we think are good and true and right, and then saying, well, this is what God wants us to do. You know, like we decide, we as humans dictate to the creator what it is we think is important for us to be doing, right? And you'd think that people would say, hey, you know what? Gosh, we're kind of small compared to God, don't you think? Like maybe we ought to go see if he has anything to say about this before we start telling him what ought to be done.
Yeah. So this does bring things right to the point I was trying to make, which is this, that this world is God's threshing floor. This is where he is producing his grain, where he is refining out that precious gem or metal that he wants, removing the dross, removing the things that do not satisfy him, that do not please him. And the way he does that is through the very sufferings we're talking about. Just the exact same way that you thresh grain, the exact same way that you refine things by passing them through heat or through chemicals, or some process that essentially changes the quality of their existence. This world is God's threshing floor, and he threshes human beings in it. So if anyone gets offended at the prospect of suffering in this world, they have delusions of grandeur. They're thinking of themselves as if they are God, and therefore they know or should dictate what the purpose of life in this world ought to be. God is very good to us. Even though he is actually threshing this world and working on human beings to precipitate that number of human beings that belongs with him eternally, even though he's doing that, he is so generous to every single person, including the unbeliever who hates him. As a matter of fact, look at the world as it is. Some of the wealthiest people, do you know any Christian, anybody whom we would say, I would like to follow this man's example spiritually, who numbers among the richest men in the world today? As far as I know, there's no such person. The wealthiest people in the world today are people who are either lukewarm in the faith, and frankly, I don't even know anyone who is a believer among them. All of them seem to be unbelievers. And some of the wealthiest of them are vile unbelievers who hate the Lord. Why is that the case? Scriptures are very clear. Not a single thing that a man has comes to him except the Lord gives it to him. Not that there is nothing in this world that anyone has which is not a gift from the Lord. Whether you speak of the brilliance of, say, Steve Jobs, or the wealth of what's this Amazon guy, you know, whatever it is, it comes from the Lord. That's the fact of it. And yet, these things are not why the Lord put us here. Believers themselves who go through the exit, and yeah, this is another thing I was going to mention too, that when we're talking about how everybody suffers in this world, believers suffer more. We know that once you get to the level where you're working in ministry, I think any of us here would understand this by now, that at that point, when you have passed through the test of maturity and you are now doing ministry, I hope we get that it simply means that now suffering is natural to you. It's not something that comes periodically in your life. You're now going through it. It's now normal to you. Your daily life is a suffering, which is exactly why Paul said that he was being poured out like wine. Once you come into that point of existence where you have learned the truth, you've matured in the truth, and you're maintaining progress, because you don't just reach one level and that's it. You move on to something else. No, you're carrying all of this along. When you mature in the truth, you're now continuing to mature in the truth. You face the test of maturity, and now not only are you facing the tests of maturity, they're just your normal existence. Once you come into ministry, that's normal to you, because once you become a shield for the church, which is what ministry is about, because you're protecting your brothers and sisters. You're helping them to grow spiritually. You're promoting their every good effort that they're putting in to please the Lord. You have become a facilitator. You have become one of those joints that supplies what the body needs to grow. You've become a critical point. Then you can be sure Satan focuses, here it is. You become a believer, he devotes resources to you. You start to grow spiritually, he devotes more resources to you. You decide, you get to spiritual maturity, he devotes even more resources to you. When you get to this point, he concentrates as much of his energy as he can spare on you. That's what happens. So you find that progressing, if you decide that what you want to do is go with the Lord, it's pain that you're inviting into your life. And yet the Lord comforts you so much that you get to the point that you don't even notice that this is your life's experience. Which is, for example, one reason that many of the things we read in Professor Robert's emails, we might not actually be reading the way that it actually is. When he talks about having a problem in his eye, or his knee is giving him trouble, or this or that, we don't actually recognize that these things are just not, he's giving you snippets of his experience as someone who has come to this point where he's doing ministry. He is getting far more flack than you're thinking of.
Well, I mean,
he's getting far more flack than he's talking about.
Everything that he faces from his university, right? The pressures, the colleagues fired, not being appreciated, teaching 5 classes a semester.
Exactly.
We all face it individually. Everyone has their own burdens to bear. I mean, and the point that we're making here is not only, so this section, right, we started out with this whole difference between unbelievers and believers, but the thing that Christians really don't like is this idea that, well, the more serious you are as a Christian, the harder things get, right? So
exactly.
It's not just binary unbelievers and unbelievers. Basically, the more lukewarm you are, the more Satan will ignore you, right?
Exactly.
You're not a threat. You're not a threat to his plan.
He has limited resources. So why would he be chasing after someone who does not pose any real threat to him? Once he has captured you, imprisoned you, put you out of combat for whatever reason, he doesn't have to put that much energy into you anymore. But the more threatening you are to his plans, the more, because the person who has attained to ministry is no longer now walking with the Lord for himself. He is no longer just pleasing the Lord now in order to get this or that or whatever. This person has come to the point where he is now a facilitator. He is the one who helps other people to become mature, to grow spiritually, to bear fruit for the Lord. That person is the worst thing that could happen to Satan from the army of the Lord. He's if the person has the gift of evangelism, this is one of those people if we're using the military analogy, this would be one of those units that you send out into enemy territory to rescue people. He would be constantly harassing Satan's security systems everywhere to break people out of his jails. That's what would be happening. And if you're a pastor teacher, that means that you're training lethal units to send out into the army. Not only that, you're also directing their movements in many ways, because as long as a teacher exists, he has a unit behind him that he is leading into the war at every point. So, however you look at this, Satan cannot ignore anybody who is getting serious about the truth, or who has gotten serious, or who has got anywhere, or who has come to this level where they're actually helping other people to be productive for the Lord. It's a terrifying thought to him that more people should get there, which is why so few people get there, because he continues to devote resources to prevent people from attaining to those levels. So, but the bottom line that I wanted to draw here is that the pain we go through in this life is normal to our experience. Even if we were unbelievers, all unbelievers suffer one thing or the other, because this world is a threshing floor. This is a painful place to be in. But for us believers, if we understand that growing spiritually and being useful to the Lord is necessarily tied with the pain that everybody is experiencing. The more useful you are to the Lord, the more devoted you are to the Lord, the more of this you're going to have. then instead of thinking of it as something to be afraid of, instead of thinking of it as something to escape, you'll be seeing it exactly as joy, and you'll be seeing it as a compliment from the Lord, that the Lord is actually saying, this one is one of mine. He's doing his job. And with every difficulty you come into as someone who's serious with the Lord, you find comfort that's commensurate to it. This is something that Paul told the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, that with the same, because of the pains they went through, they were comforted by the Lord. And with that same comfort, they're able to comfort those who go through the same pain. That's what our lives are. Whatever we do get comfort. For example, whatever Professor Robert has gone through, the Lord has sustained his job and continue to provide him with the means that he needs to continue to do his job. The Lord, of course, his pastor teaching ministry. We know that he has the support of many of those who come to his website. We pray for him. And much of his work is still being promoted in this way. I mean, we're having this conversation over something that he wrote. Mm-hmm. All of these things are comfort from the Lord. And we don't know how many, there are innumerable ways that the Lord is providing this comfort to those who choose to walk with him. So the pain we go through is not the whole story. That's not the end of the story. There is still another side to it. There's a comfort, but failing to see that it is worth it means that that comfort will not even get through to you, because you're all hung up on what you're suffering at this time. And of course, at some point, someone like Demas would forsake the Lord because that suffering is just too much. It would be easier to simply be an unbeliever and enjoy the pleasures of this world. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, the threshing floor. Yeah, it's the big analogy pushed here. I mean, if we view, I mean, I think just to go back to the military analogy as well, right? I think sometimes it's helpful to use as many analogies as possible, right? Because some people resonate with one a little more than the other, right? We've been on and on about how this life's a battlefield, right? But what happens after the battle is you're fighting for something. There's a purpose to this, right? A method to everything that we go about, right? And when you think about when people return victorious, that's going to be us on Judgment Day, right? If we do that which God has called us, we're going to be the ones receiving the medals, right? We're going to be the ones with the merit and the honor. And we give things up to be sure, right? But it's not for no reason, right? And God will not leave us undecorated, right? On this.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good analogy. Of course, the modern equivalent of that is politics and all the campaigning and everything. Because in the past, what would happen is that a king would go to war and a bunch of nobles and knights would join him. And if they distinguished themselves on the battlefield, if he conquered that other nation, he would divide the land. And some people new dukes, for example, would come into existence, new earls and new barons. People would get their own land and they would have people to farm them. They could build castles of their own and so on and so forth. Today, it's actually politics, right? So if you are very devoted to this person's campaign and you work very hard for them and they win the election, you stand very, you stand in a very good position. You could get appointed to one very juicy position or another. That's what people fight for. And they do get it. In this world, how much more the Lord?
Yeah.
How much more with the Lord? When he has...
Of course, unlike the world, which is zero sum, God's rewards are not zero sum. So, the point I always like to make to people is God can reward absolutely. Like, let's say everyone in the world decided that they were going to start taking spiritual growth seriously, right? It's not like God run out of things to give people, right?
Exactly.
He's God.
He doesn't run.
This point is huge because like this whole incentive, I mean, we've talked about reward motivation a lot before. I mean, I was just bringing up the military analogy, just because you spent the last 10 minutes or so going over this threshing analogy, right? But in the same way that there's discomfort and pain in the threshing, right? To separate the wheat from the chaff. Well, there's definitely pain and suffering in war, right? But my point was that after the war is when the rewards come. That is when recognition for service comes about. but it's delayed, it's temporary. So people who are among the trenches of the battlefield, all they see is dirt and mud and blood. They don't see what comes after. And yet that's exactly what we have to keep in mind as Christians. I mean, it's not like wheat and chaff are sentient, but if they were, they don't see the barns either, right? Like we have all of this that will come about in the final evaluation of things, but we don't see it here and now today, right? And that, like we've already mentioned before today, that is the challenge. But once we understand it, like you said, like what we have highlighted here, once we understand it and we see where we're going, what the point of it is, that's how we maintain the positive attitude of joy, right? Not joy because we're going through bad things, but because we know what's behind them, that we understand them for what they truly are. All right, well, it's getting late, so we'll cut off here. I mean, we'll definitely, there's plenty more to talk about. We didn't even get through all the points I had pulled out. But I think the two analogies that we just closed with, I think are a very good way for us to situate ourselves. I'm just going to go on a couple-minute tangent here. I think throughout much of this study, we've used that military, the analogy or metaphor. I mean, we've already talked about how it's not really a metaphor because it really is life or death. But whenever we get into these things that are hard to understand, I think analogies prove especially useful. I mean, analogies are always somewhat imperfect, but just to get us that intuitive picture, for things that seem hard or almost abstract to the point where we can't relate to them, I think sometimes that's when analogies help serve us best. So I'm glad that we sort of brought up both of the things that we've mentioned, just because I think, at least to my mind, this helps me relate to it a lot better. Like we can sort of see the point then, because it's not, as we were talking about before, just clinical, right? It's something that we can sort of see how it works. We can see the purpose behind it, the things that go into it, the wider things in play. And also in these situations, we sort of take ourselves out of the equation a little bit. Because, most of us, at least us here, are not personally soldiers. And of course, we're not farmers. So we can sort of intellectually grasp the idea of separating grain from chaff. But I was just my meditation here a little bit on the idea of analogies as being very useful in these difficult things that are hard to understand and accept. Yeah, well, we'll close with that today. We'll pick back up here in this section on personal tribulation. We have several more things to talk about. We did get to some of this today, but I mean, I think a degree more of maybe what we'll talk about next week is just coping with some of this testing and suffering. We've talking about discerning between types of it and stuff now, and also, how important confession is and that sort of thing. But like, we'll get back a little bit more. This verse here in 1 Corinthians 10, I think, is the one that talks about how God never sends testing our way that he doesn't give us a way through, right? We'll perhaps talk some more about those ways through next time. All right, well, I think we'll cut there for the week.